Stop whatever you are doing, because what you are about to hear is not a drill, not a simulation, and not the kind of geopolitical speculation that gets walked back by morning. At 0347 hours Eastern Standard Time, the Islamic Republic of Iran executed a coordinated naval blockade operation that has sealed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and effectively transformed the Red Sea into a strategic dead zone where 400 United States military supply vessels are now trapped, immobilized, and cut off from both forward deployment destinations and home ports. This is not a temporary disruption to commercial shipping lanes. This is the complete severance of the primary maritime logistics artery that sustains NATO military operations across 3 continents, and the economic consequences are already cascading through European capitals with a speed and severity that has left Western leadership paralyzed. The number that Pentagon logistics commanders are processing right now is 400. 400 supply ships carrying everything from precision-guided munitions to armored vehicle replacement parts, from aviation fuel to medical supplies, from communications equipment to basic provisions for forward-deployed forces. These vessels represent the logistical backbone of American power projection capability in the Mediterranean theater, the Middle East, and the Eastern Atlantic. Without these supply lines flowing, American military bases from Ramstein to Al Udeid face inventory depletion timelines measured in days, not weeks. NATO force readiness begins degrading immediately. European defense industrial production loses its primary export route to international markets. The economic damage is not theoretical. Markets opened in Tokyo 3 hours ago, already showing energy futures spiking 47% as traders process the implications of Red Sea closure for global oil transportation. Iran has just demonstrated a capability that defense analysts have theorized about for 2 decades, but that Western naval commanders insisted could never be operationally executed. They have established a multi-layered naval exclusion zone combining anti-ship cruise missiles, coastal defense systems, submarine deployments, and swarm tactics using fast attack craft that has rendered the southern Red Sea completely inaccessible to Western military and commercial shipping. The execution reveals planning sophistication, operational coordination, and tactical effectiveness that fundamentally challenges every assumption undergirding American naval supremacy doctrine. If this channel has been giving you the analysis that cuts through the noise of official narratives and mainstream defense commentary, now is the moment to make sure you never miss an update. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with everyone in your network who is serious about understanding what is actually happening at the sharp edge of global power competition. What unfolds over the next 40 minutes will explain exactly how Iran achieved what the United States Navy considered impossible, why NATO's economic architecture is now facing systemic collapse, and what this moment means for the permanent restructuring of global maritime power. Tonight's analysis takes you inside every dimension of this strategic catastrophe. First, the technical capabilities Iran deployed to establish and maintain a blockade that American carrier strike groups cannot break. Second, the immediate operational crisis facing trapped U.S. supply vessels and forward-deployed forces now facing critical supply shortages. Third, the economic detonation occurring across European economies as energy supplies, manufacturing inputs, and export routes simultaneously collapse. Fourth, the global strategic realignment as nations worldwide reassess American security guarantees that have just been proven worthless. Fifth, the irreversible transformation of maritime power competition and what this night means for the permanent end of American naval dominance. The operation Iran executed to seal the Red Sea began not hours, but months ago, with systematic deployment of assets designed specifically to deny sea control to the United States Navy. Western intelligence agencies were tracking components of this deployment, but catastrophically failed to recognize these disparate elements were being positioned for coordinated employment in a single, decisive operation. The sophistication of Iranian operational security and deception measures meant that even as satellite imagery showed weapons being moved into position, American analysts interpreted the deployments as defensive posturing rather than offensive preparation. The primary long-range interdiction capability comes from the Qadr family of anti-ship cruise missiles, specifically the Qadr F variant with operational range extending beyond 350 kilometers and terminal phase velocity approaching Mach 3. These systems have been deployed in hardened coastal positions along the eastern approaches to Bab el-Mandeb, positioned with overlapping engagement zones that create a no-go area extending 200 nautical miles into the Red Sea from the Yemeni coastline. The missiles employ active radar homing in terminal phase with sea-skimming flight profiles that defeat traditional shipboard radar detection until final engagement windows measured in seconds rather than minutes. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has positioned a minimum of 60 of these launch platforms in dispersed, hardened sites that satellite reconnaissance has difficulty distinguishing from civilian infrastructure. The missiles themselves are road mobile, meaning they can be relocated between launches, making counter-battery targeting essentially impossible for standoff strike platforms. Each launcher carries a minimum reload capacity, meaning initial inventory available for employment exceeds 120 missiles before requiring resupply from depot stocks. The coastal defense layer includes Nor and Gator anti-ship missiles with shorter engagement ranges but higher volume availability. Iranian forces have deployed these systems in dense concentrations along the entire eastern Red Sea littoral, creating a defensive belt where any surface vessel operating within 50 kilometers of the coastline faces simultaneous engagement by multiple missiles coming from multiple azimuths. The saturation attack doctrine Iran has practiced for years against simulated carrier strike group targets is now being employed against stationary supply vessels with zero defensive maneuvering capability. The subsurface threat dimension is what makes this blockade qualitatively different from anything Western navies have faced since the Cold War. Iran has deployed Kilo-class submarines, Fateh-class indigenous submarines, and Ghadir-class midget submarines throughout the southern Red Sea operational area. These platforms are operating in shallow water environments where their small size and diesel-electric propulsion make acoustic detection extraordinarily difficult, even for the most advanced anti-submarine warfare systems the United States Navy possesses. The Kilo-class boats carry 533mm torpedo tubes with modern wake-homing torpedoes that are specifically designed to defeat American surface combatant defensive systems. The Fateh-class boats, despite being smaller, carry modern Chinese origin torpedoes and can operate in water depths as shallow as 20 meters, meaning they can patrol in littoral zones where American submarines cannot safely maneuver. The Ghadir-class midget submarines, while limited in endurance and weapons capacity, excel at stationary ambush operations in choke points, exactly the tactical environment Bab el-Mandeb represents. The swarm attack capability that closes the tactical envelope comes from Revolutionary Guard fast attack craft operating in flotillas of 20 to 30 vessels. These small boats carry a combination of anti-ship cruise missiles, heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and crews willing to conduct suicide attacks against high-value targets. The tactical doctrine calls for coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming defensive systems through volume rather than sophistication. American carrier strike groups have trained against this threat for years, but training exercises operate under safety constraints and rules of engagement that do not reflect actual combat conditions. In genuine engagement scenarios, the defensive fire control problems become exponentially more complex when dozens of small high-speed targets are maneuvering aggressively, while larger threats from missiles and submarines are developing simultaneously. The cognitive and sensor processing loads exceed what shipboard defensive systems were designed to handle. What makes Iran's blockade operationally sustainable is the strategic depth of their defensive deployment. This is not a forward-deployed force that can be isolated and destroyed through American standoff strike capabilities. The missile launch sites, submarine bases, and fast attack craft facilities are integrated into Iranian homeland defense architecture with layered air defense protection that makes direct attack prohibitively costly. Iran has deployed Russian-origin S-300 air defense systems and indigenous Bavar 373 long-range surface-to-air missile systems throughout the coastal regions supporting the blockade. These systems provide engagement capability against American strike aircraft and cruise missiles out to ranges exceeding 200 kilometers. The air defense network is integrated with early warning radars, command and control nodes, and electronic warfare systems that create a comprehensive anti-access environment. American strike planners are confronting the reality that any attempt to destroy the blockade infrastructure requires committing hundreds of strike sorties against hardened, defended targets, while simultaneously defending those strike packages against Iranian air defenses and potential retaliatory strikes against regional bases. The cost-exchange ratio is catastrophically unfavorable. The United States would need to expend thousands of precision-guided munitions costing billions of dollars to potentially degrade a capability that Iran can reconstitute using weapon systems costing a fraction of American inventory values. The 400 trapped supply vessels represent the complete failure of American logistics doctrine that assumed permanent sea control and uncontested access to global maritime routes. These ships are not combat vessels. They are contracted cargo ships, roll-on, roll-off vehicle carriers, ammunition ships, and fuel tankers that were transiting the Red Sea en route to Mediterranean destinations or returning to Atlantic ports after completing resupply missions to Middle Eastern bases. The immediate crisis facing U.S. Central Command and European Command is that forward-deployed forces are now isolated from their primary supply chain. Every American military installation from Germany to Qatar depends on continuous maritime logistics flow to maintain operational readiness. Ammunition stocks are consumed daily in training and operational activities. Aviation fuel is consumed with every flight hour. Vehicle parts are needed continuously as equipment wears from operational use. Medical supplies have shelf lives and need regular replenishment. Basic provisions from food to hygiene supplies are consumed and must be replaced. The inventory timelines Pentagon logistics officers are calculating right now are terrifying. Air Force bases in Europe and the Middle East have aviation fuel reserves measured in days of operational flight hours, not weeks. Ground force ammunition stocks for training and operational contingencies are depleted to critical levels within 14 days without resupply. Vehicle maintenance facilities face parts shortages that ground equipment within 3 weeks. The entire readiness degradation curve shows American forward-deployed combat power dropping below operational effectiveness thresholds in a time frame measured in days. The alternate routing options are either prohibitively expensive or operationally impossible. Rerouting cargo around the Cape of Good Hope adds 3,500 nautical miles and approximately 12 days of transit time to every supply run. The additional fuel costs, vessel charter costs, and opportunity costs of having ships in transit rather than completing delivery cycles pushes logistics expenses into financially unsustainable territory. The United States military logistics budget cannot absorb a doubling of maritime transportation costs while simultaneously facing the procurement expenses required to replace degraded readiness. Airlift capacity cannot compensate for the loss of maritime logistics volume. The United States Air Force's entire strategic airlift fleet operating at maximum surge capacity could move perhaps 5% of the cargo volume that maritime supply vessels deliver monthly. The fuel consumption, maintenance hours, and crew fatigue associated with sustained airlift operations would degrade the strategic airlift fleet itself within weeks. There is no airlift solution to a maritime blockade of this scale. The economic consequences are detonating across European economies with a speed that has caught political leadership completely unprepared. The Red Sea closure immediately severs the primary route for Middle Eastern oil and natural gas reaching European markets. Approximately 40% of Europe's crude oil imports and 25% of liquefied natural gas imports transit the Red Sea and Suez Canal. That flow has stopped completely. European energy markets opened this morning facing simultaneous supply shock and price explosion. Brent crude futures spiked 47% in the first 90 minutes of trading before exchange circuit breakers halted transactions. Natural gas futures in European markets surged 63% before similar trading halts were implemented. These are not speculative movements. These are markets processing the reality that energy supply chains have been severed and alternatives do not exist at anywhere near the volumes required. Germany's industrial economy, which consumes more natural gas than any other European nation, is facing production shutdowns across energy-intensive manufacturing sectors within 72 hours. Chemical plants, steel mills, automotive manufacturing facilities, and heavy industrial operations cannot function without continuous natural gas supply. The inventories stored in strategic reserves and commercial facilities provide perhaps 1 week of consumption at normal industrial activity levels. The economic damage extends far beyond energy markets. European export industries depend on Red Sea shipping routes to reach Asian markets. German automotive manufacturers, French aerospace companies, Italian luxury goods producers, and British pharmaceutical companies all rely on containerized shipping through Suez to reach customers in Asia and Africa. These export revenues represent approximately 18% of total European Union gross domestic product. That revenue stream has stopped. If you want analysis this sharp, this deep, this willing to challenge official narratives, subscribe now to ensure you never miss an update. What is unfolding is not a temporary market disruption that will be resolved through diplomatic negotiations. This is the permanent restructuring of global energy markets, maritime trade routes, and economic power distribution. The financial contagion is spreading through European banking systems with terrifying velocity. Banks holding loans to shipping companies are facing immediate default risks as vessel operators lose revenue streams overnight. Insurance companies that underwrote cargo policies and hull policies are calculating exposure to claims that will exceed annual premium revenues. Investment funds holding European industrial equity are watching portfolio values collapse as markets price in sustained production disruptions. European governments are facing fiscal catastrophes as tax revenues collapse while demands for economic support programs explode. Unemployment claims are being filed by workers laid off from industries forced to halt production. Energy subsidies to prevent household heating costs from becoming politically unsustainable are consuming emergency budget allocations. The fiscal mathematics are impossible. European governments cannot simultaneously replace lost tax revenue, fund expanded social support, subsidize energy costs, and maintain existing spending commitments. The political consequences are already manifesting in emergency sessions, coalition government crises, and public protests. German Chancellor is facing no confidence motions from coalition partners demanding immediate action to restore energy supplies that the government has no power to restore. French president is confronting street demonstrations as fuel prices spike beyond affordability for transportation workers. Italian government is negotiating with opposition parties to form emergency economic unity government. NATO's entire operational posture is disintegrating as the economic crisis undermines political cohesion and financial capability to sustain military readiness. Alliance members are suspending defense spending commitments to redirect funds to economic crisis management. Joint exercises are being canceled as fuel allocations are rationed for essential operations only. Forward deployments are being withdrawn as host nations face domestic political pressure to reduce foreign military presence, consuming scarce resources. The United States security guarantee that has underpinned European defense architecture since 1949 has just been exposed as operationally meaningless. American promises to defend NATO allies are worthless if American forces cannot be supplied, cannot be reinforced, and cannot project power beyond their immediate bases. European governments are processing the horrifying reality that they are strategically alone, facing potential adversaries without the American protection they have depended upon for 75 years. Russia is observing these developments with undisguised strategic satisfaction. Every percentage point of American strategic attention consumed by the Red Sea crisis is attention not available for Ukraine, not available for NATO's eastern flank, not available for Baltic Sea security. The pressure relief Russia is experiencing across every confrontation axis with the West is exactly what Moscow has sought through years of strategic coordination with Tehran. China is conducting its own strategic assessment of what Iran's successful blockade means for Taiwan contingency planning. If Iran can successfully deny sea control to the United States Navy in the confined waters of the Red Sea, what does that imply about American capability to maintain sea control in the Western Pacific against a Chinese military with exponentially greater resources and sophistication? The answer emerging from Chinese strategic analysis is that American naval dominance is a myth sustained by decades of operating against inferior opponents in permissive environments. Nations throughout the global south are watching carefully as the United States proves unable to protect its own supply lines or fulfill security commitments to allies. The lesson being absorbed is that American hegemony is a hollow shell, that self-reliance is the only viable security strategy, and that alignment with emerging powers offers better prospects than dependence on declining Western capabilities. Saudi Arabia is conducting urgent reassessment of security relationships and regional positioning. If the United States cannot keep the Red Sea open, what good are American security guarantees to Riyadh? The calculations driving Saudi strategic planning are shifting rapidly toward accommodation with Tehran, reduction of American military presence, and pursuit of independent security capabilities. Turkey is accelerating its strategic autonomy agenda, reducing NATO coordination while expanding independent regional initiatives. The demonstration that NATO cannot protect fundamental alliance interests is validation of Turkish decisions to acquire Russian air defense systems and pursue independent foreign policy regardless of American objections. Pakistan is observing that its strategic hedging between American partnerships and Chinese alignment has been vindicated. The future belongs to nations that maintain strategic flexibility rather than exclusive dependence on Western security architectures that are proving unable to deliver on fundamental commitments. The global order is being restructured in real time as every nation conducts emergency reassessment of strategic alignments based on demonstrated capabilities rather than historical assumptions. The unipolar moment that began with the Soviet collapse in 1991 is ending not through gradual transition, but through sudden collapse of confidence in American power. The maritime domain is being fundamentally transformed as Iran demonstrates that sea control is not a permanent condition, but a contested capability that can be denied through asymmetric strategies. The United States Navy has operated for decades on the assumption that aircraft carriers and submarine capabilities guarantee sea control anywhere American forces choose to operate. That assumption has been destroyed. The implications extend far beyond the Red Sea. If coastal defense systems, submarines, and swarm tactics can deny sea control in confined waters, what does that mean for American ability to operate in the Taiwan Strait, the Persian Gulf, the Baltic Sea, or any other contested maritime environment? The answer emerging from global naval analysis is that American sea control is viable only in open oceans far from adversary coastlines, a recognition that renders traditional power projection doctrine obsolete. Iran has achieved through strategic patience and asymmetric investment what direct military confrontation could never accomplish. They have severed the logistics network sustaining American forward presence, collapsed the economic architecture supporting NATO cohesion, and demonstrated to the entire world that American military power can be effectively neutralized through capabilities that cost a tiny fraction of American defense spending. The world that existed 24 hours ago, where American naval dominance was assumed and sea lanes were presumed open to Western commerce and military movement, is gone forever. The world being born in this moment is one where maritime access is contested, where regional powers can deny sea control to global navies, where economic networks can be severed overnight, and where the architecture of Western hegemony is revealed as fundamentally fragile. Subscribe to this channel because in a world this dangerous, analysis this sharp is not optional, it is necessary. What you have just witnessed is not a temporary crisis that diplomatic negotiations will resolve. This is the permanent end of an era where American power could operate without effective challenge. The balance has shifted. The order has collapsed. The future belongs to powers willing to challenge the old hegemon and capable of making that challenge effective. The Pentagon is stunned. NATO is paralyzed. European economies are collapsing. 400 American supply ships remain trapped, unable to move forward or retreat, symbols of a global power structure that no longer functions. Iran has achieved what strategists will study for generations as the moment when regional powers demonstrated they could defeat global hegemons through asymmetric strategies and strategic patience. History will mark this night as the end of American naval supremacy and the beginning of a multipolar maritime order where sea control is contested, denied, and fought for rather than assumed and taken for granted. The unipolar world died tonight in the Red Sea. What emerges from its collapse will be determined by nations willing to act while the old hegemon remains paralyzed, trapped by its own failed assumptions and obsolete doctrines. Stay sharp, stay ahead, and never stop asking the questions that matter. The world has changed permanently, and only those who understand what just happened will be prepared for what comes next.